About 66 million years ago, a giant asteroid named Chicxulub was hurtling through space toward Earth at a speed faster than any object humans have ever built. And the interesting thing is that most people today view the existence of humans as if it were the inevitable result of evolution, as if sooner or later an intelligent civilization would appear on this planet. But physics does not think that way. Physics does not care about destiny, does not care which species deserves to exist, but only cares about physical conditions and probability. And sometimes the entire history of life can change just because a cosmic object hits the right spot on a planet at the right time. That is why the question I always find extremely strange is this: what would happen if that asteroid missed its target? If you rewind time to the end of the Cretaceous period, right before the asteroid appeared, you would not see a world in decline. You would see one of the most successful ecosystems that ever existed on this planet. The climate back then was much hotter and more humid than today because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was higher than now. There were almost no permanent ice caps at the two poles, which made sea levels hundreds of meters higher than today. A very large part of North America was once divided by enormous shallow seas stretching across the continent. And here is the interesting part. Subtropical forests once grew near the polar regions, where today there is only ice and snow. Paleontologists have even found evidence that crocodiles once lived near the North Pole, something that is almost impossible in today's climate. That means Earth at that time was stable and warm in a very different way from the world today. And within that world, dinosaurs were not at all the clumsy creatures as old movies once described. Tyrannosaurus rex was a predator with extremely advanced forward-facing vision, meaning it had a very good ability to perceive distance like modern efficient predators. Triceratops was not just a giant herbivore, but more like biological tanks living in large herds with an astonishing defense system. Duck-billed dinosaurs possessed chewing structures so complex that many modern mammal species would struggle to match. In the sky, the largest flying lizards had wingspans wider than many modern private planes, but could still fly thanks to an extremely light and optimized bone structure. Meanwhile, mammals at that time were mostly small creatures that lived at night, hiding in the shadow of the dinosaur world to avoid direct competition. And the most important thing is this: there is no strong scientific evidence that dinosaurs were on the brink of extinction before the asteroid appeared. At the exact moment that rock was hurtling toward Earth, dinosaurs were still the most successful dominant animal group on the planet. For many decades, humans often imagined dinosaurs as slow, stupid creatures that were nearly evolutionary failures. The popular idea was that smarter, more adaptable mammals would eventually replace them as a natural step in evolution. But modern fossils show that the real story is almost completely the opposite. Dinosaurs dominated Earth for about 165 million years. Think about that number for a moment. The entire history of modern humans is only a few 100,000 years, and our industrial civilization has existed for less than a few centuries. Meanwhile, dinosaurs ruled the planet for so long that it almost exceeds human time intuition. And what is even stranger is that they never really disappeared completely. Birds today are actually direct descendants of a branch of two-legged meat-eating dinosaurs. That means every time you see a crow, a sparrow, or an eagle, you are looking at a living version of a dinosaur. That is not a metaphor. That is real biology. And when scientists began to understand more about the bodies of dinosaurs, they realized these creatures were much more efficient than the outdated image humans once imagined. Many species possessed a one-way airflow respiratory system similar to modern birds, meaning air continuously moved in one direction through the lungs instead of in and out like in mammals. That allowed much more efficient oxygen exchange. And here is the interesting part. If you want to operate a body weighing tens of tons but still move continuously, you need an extremely powerful respiratory system. Physics does not allow anything else to happen. The hollow bones of dinosaurs are also a perfect example. When people first discovered that, many thought such a skeleton must be weak. But in reality, it was an extremely smart biological engineering solution. You reduce weight, but still maintain the necessary mechanical strength. Very similar to the way humans design hollow steel beams in modern structures. That helped many giant dinosaur species move much more efficiently than carrying heavy solid skeletons. Studies on bone structure also show that many species grew extremely fast, meaning their metabolic rate could be higher than the previous image of lazy, cold-blooded reptiles. Some species could reach gigantic sizes in just a few decades, something almost impossible if the body functioned too slowly. And then paleontologists began to find other signs. Fossil footprints show that many species moved in herds. Egg nests show parental care behavior. Some evidence even suggests that many predator species could coordinate with each other to a certain extent. In other words, the dinosaur world was much more complex and dynamic than the old human imagination. Meanwhile, mammals at that time were not at all tiny geniuses preparing to take over the world. Most were just small creatures living in the shadows, existing in ecological niches that dinosaurs had not completely occupied. And this is what I always find most important when talking about evolution. Evolution has no plan. It does not try to create humans. It does not aim for intelligence as a final goal. Evolution only keeps what works efficiently in the current environment. If a species is capable enough to survive and reproduce, it will continue to exist. And dinosaurs did that successfully for more than 160 million years. Therefore, if the asteroid had not collided, there is no clear scientific reason to suggest that dinosaurs would naturally disappear. Mammals did not defeat dinosaurs in any great evolutionary competition. They simply happened to survive after a planetary disaster that dinosaurs unfortunately had to endure more. People often imagine the asteroid like a giant bomb falling and everything dying immediately. But reality is much more complex. The real danger is how that collision changed the energy balance of the entire planet. Think about this for a moment. Every ecosystem on Earth ultimately runs on energy from the sun. Plants absorb light. Animals eat plants. Other animals eat them. The entire web of life operates thanks to that energy flow. And when the Chicxulub asteroid struck the area that is now the Yucatan Peninsula, it did not just create a giant crater. It released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs in a few seconds. Rock was melted. Soil and rock vaporized. Thousands of billions of tons of material were ejected into the atmosphere. But here is the truly terrifying part. The area where the asteroid impacted contained a large amount of sulfur-rich rock. When all that material was blown into the upper atmosphere, sulfur began to form aerosol particles that reflected sunlight extremely effectively. And suddenly the planet began to lose its main energy source. Sunlight diminished for a long time. Temperatures dropped sharply. Photosynthesis nearly collapsed. And once plants began dying en masse, the entire food chain began to break down in a domino effect. The interesting thing is that this extinction event did not really target dinosaurs. It targeted all creatures dependent on large-scale stable ecosystems. Giant species like herbivorous dinosaurs needed enormous amounts of food every day to survive. When plants disappeared in a short time, they were the first group to face crisis. And right after that, the predators that depended on them also began to die. Physics does not care how strong you are if the energy flow feeding your body is cut off. A dinosaur weighing tens of tons could not simply wait for things to get better. It needed continuous energy to operate its muscles, circulation, and metabolism. But the disaster did not even stop there. When the debris ejected from the impact fell back into the atmosphere, they heated up due to friction with the air and could turn the global sky into a giant furnace for a short time. Some models show that heat was enough to cause wildfires on a continental scale. Imagine the entire sky glowing red while forests across the planet began burning almost simultaneously. And the oceans were not much safer. The enormous amount of gas and material entering the atmosphere then dissolved into seawater, changing the acidity of the oceans. Water temperatures fluctuated dramatically. Many marine ecosystems began to collapse. Plankton died off, and that triggered a series of underwater food chains being destroyed. Meanwhile, those small mammals possessed a very strange advantage. They needed much less food. They could eat almost anything that remained. Many species could dig burrows, hide underground, and survive the long, dark, cold period. In other words, this extinction event was basically a planetary scale energy crisis. It was not a battle between better species and worse species. It was just physics imposing completely new living conditions on every creature on Earth. And this is the part that always makes me shudder the most. If that asteroid had fallen into a slightly deeper body of water, the amount of sulfur vaporized could have been much lower. If fewer aerosols entered the atmosphere, sunlight might not have been blocked for so long. If photosynthesis had not completely collapsed, perhaps most of the ecosystem would have survived. That means the entire evolutionary history of Earth could change just because of a small difference in the impact location on the planet's surface. Imagine the Chicxulub asteroid arriving a few minutes late or a few minutes early in its orbit. Just an extremely small difference in the movement of the solar system. That rock would fly right past Earth's orbit and continue drifting deep into the darkness of space instead of slamming into the Yucatan Peninsula. The next morning, the sun would still rise over the forests of the late Cretaceous. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs would still continue moving across the steam-filled plains. The predator species would still patrol their territories. The oceans would still be full of giant creatures. And no creature on the planet would know that the entire history of life had just avoided a planetary disaster. That is the part that always strikes me as the strangest about natural history. Sometimes the difference between a world with humans and a world that never has us is just a few minutes in the movement of a cosmic object. If that extinction event had not happened, Earth's large ecosystems would continue operating almost normally. Forests would still cover most of the planet. Food chains would still be stable. The oceans would still continue to contain giant marine reptiles. Herbivorous dinosaur species would still dominate most of the land. The giant predators would still control the top of the food chain. And mammals would continue living in the shadow of that world. This is the important thing that many people often misunderstand about evolution. Evolution is not like a revolution that happens overnight. It is extremely slow. Major changes usually require millions of years of continuous environmental pressure. No asteroid means no shock strong enough to wipe out the currently dominant ecosystems. And if those ecosystems remain stable, the species dominating them would continue to hold the advantage. That means mammals would very likely still only be small creatures living at night, digging burrows, climbing trees, or existing in ecological niches that dinosaurs had not completely controlled. There might still be species similar to rodents, insectivores, or small tree-dwelling animals. But there is no clear reason for them to suddenly develop into giant species and eventually create a technological civilization. And the most interesting thing is that even if the asteroid never appeared, Earth would still not stand still. Humans often think that if there is no disaster, then everything will stay the same. But physics does not allow that to happen. The continents would still continue to drift a few centimeters each year. Mountains would still continue to form. The oceans would still change their currents. The climate would still fluctuate according to long cycles spanning millions of years. That means the dinosaur world would not be a fixed picture. It would still continue to evolve and change non-stop under the planet's physical laws. Some species would disappear, others would appear. New ecosystems would form. But the biggest difference is that this would happen in a world where dinosaurs remained the dominant animal group. The interesting thing is that even in the timeline where the asteroid never collided, Earth would not forever maintain the hot and humid climate of the late Cretaceous. This planet is always changing because geology has never truly stood still. The continents would still drift on the molten mantle beneath them. Mountains would still continue to rise. The oceans would still change their circulation patterns. And over millions of years, all those processes would begin to change the global climate in extremely profound ways. One of the most important changes would probably be the formations of the Himalayas when the Indian subcontinent collided with Asia. It may not sound very related to dinosaurs, but the physics of climate often works through such strange connections. When giant mountain ranges form, the amount of fresh rock exposed at the surface increases dramatically. Rain and chemical reactions begin to erode silicate rocks, a process that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locks it into the oceans and eventually into limestone. That means the very formation of mountains could cool the planet over time. And then there is another change that is even more important. When Antarctica gradually separated from the other continents, ocean currents began to circle around it, almost completely isolating the southern polar region from the rest of the world. That made it harder for heat from the equator to reach there. And for the first time in a very long time in Earth's history, ice began to accumulate stably at the South Pole. That is when the planet truly entered a colder period. This is extremely important for our imagined dinosaur world, because the dominant species of the late Cretaceous evolved on a planet much hotter than today. A colder Earth would create completely new selective pressures. The vast tropical forests would begin to shrink in many places. Seasons would become more distinct. Temperature fluctuations would be stronger between day and night, as well as between seasons of the year. And that would force dinosaurs to adapt or disappear. But this is where things start to become much more interesting than the old-fashioned image of giant reptiles. Modern fossils show that many dinosaur species once lived in polar regions with many months of continuous darkness each year. Some species lived in conditions much colder than what people once thought dinosaurs could tolerate. That means at least some groups already possessed more effective thermoregulation mechanisms than the classic cold-blooded reptile image. And this is where feathers became one of the most important evolutionary inventions in dinosaur history. Today we often think feathers are only related to birds, but fossil evidence shows that many small and medium-sized meat-eating dinosaurs already had feather-like structures long before modern birds appeared. At first, they might have used them for insulation, display, or sensing the environment, but when the climate began to get colder, those structures suddenly became an enormous survival advantage. A good insulating layer could make the difference between living and dying during long winters. And if you look at modern bird species, you will see that the dinosaur descendants are truly very good at adapting to freezing conditions. Penguins live in Antarctica. Crows and owls can survive Arctic winters. That shows the biological legacy of dinosaurs could be much more flexible than the popular image before. I would not even be surprised if many large meat-eating dinosaur species eventually developed mechanisms close to full warm-bloodedness. In fact, many current studies have suggested that some theropods may have possessed very high metabolic rates. If that is true, then a colder world might not kill them, but instead give them an advantage over many other species. And that is when evolution would begin to branch into completely new directions. Climate pressure would not only change body size, but also behavior, social structure, and the way creatures use energy. Some giant species might disappear because they needed too much food in a colder environment. But smaller, faster, smarter species with good insulation could begin to explode. That means in the world where the asteroid never collided, dinosaurs would not disappear. They would evolve into things very different from the image we usually see in museums today. One of the most interesting things about evolution is that sometimes what changes the entire planet is not giant predator animals or cosmic disasters, but just plants. Most people do not really think much about plants when talking about the history of life. But if you look a little closer, you will realize that almost every major biological revolution started from the way plants changed the energy flow of ecosystems. And after the Cretaceous, even in the world where the asteroid never collided, one of those revolutions would still continue to happen. Flowering plants began to spread across the planet much faster than older plant groups. That may not sound too dramatic, But in reality, it changed almost everything. Flowers produce fruit. Fruit creates a new concentrated energy source for animals. Seeds create a food source that can last longer in fluctuating environments. And suddenly those small, agile species with flexible foraging abilities would begin to have more advantage than before. You might think this is just a small change in botany, but in reality it is like the planet suddenly opening up millions of new energy sources for life. Many small animal species would begin to evolve to eat seeds, eat fruit, climb trees, or disperse seeds. Ecosystems would become much more complex. But what really changed the world was probably grass. It sounds a bit funny to say one of the most powerful organisms in planetary history is grass. But if you look at its physics and biology, you will understand why. Most trees will die if eaten continuously, but grass grows from the base instead of the top. That means you can eat almost all of its upper part, and it will still continue to regrow. That is an extremely powerful evolutionary strategy. And then grass does one other thing that is almost like biological weaponry. It incorporates extremely hard minerals like silica into its tissues. That turns grass into something extremely abrasive to animal teeth. If you want to survive by eating grass all day, you need a dental system that can withstand continuous wear. That means from that point onward, the evolution of teeth becomes a matter of life and death. On a planet that is becoming colder and drier in many areas, forests would begin to shrink. Vast grasslands would begin to appear in places that were once ancient rainforests. And this is when the dinosaur world would have to change for real. Those giant species that ate soft leaves in the forests would now face a completely new type of food, harder, less nutritious, and spread across the ground instead of up in the tree canopies. Some species might disappear, but others would adapt. I can imagine many herbivorous dinosaur branches beginning to develop increasingly complex chewing systems, similar to the way modern herbivorous animals evolved to handle grasslands. Some species might develop shorter necks but stronger jaws. Others might begin to move continuously over enormous distances to find food according to the seasons. And that is when large-scale migratory behavior could emerge. Imagine millions of creatures weighing many tons moving across continents like African antelope herds today, but on a scale that is almost beyond imagination. Herds of giant dinosaurs stretching for dozens of kilometers moving, according to the rainy and dry seasons across the ancient grasslands. Just that image alone is enough to show how different this world would be from modern Earth. The predator species would also change accordingly. Open grasslands would make ambushing in forests much harder. That means speed, coordination ability, and endurance would start to become more important. And the entire ecosystem would gradually operate in a way very similar to modern savannas, but with giant reptiles instead of mammals. What always strikes me as strange is that if you look down from above, that world could be both familiar and completely alien. You would still see migrating herds of animals, predators chasing prey, and continuous cycles of life and death. But instead of elephants, bison, or lions, the planet would be full of feathered dinosaurs, giant reptiles, and strange descendants of the ancient world that never disappeared. As the grasslands continued to expand across the planet, the world began to turn into a place that modern humans could perhaps still recognize in some way, but at the same time alien enough to look almost like it belonged to another planet. Imagine you are standing on a plain stretching hundreds of kilometers under a sky full of steam and pollen dust. Far on the horizon, the ground begins to tremble slightly in steady rhythms. Then you realize it is not an earthquake. It is hundreds of thousands of triceratops moving together across the grassland like enormous biological rivers. The interesting thing is that when animals begin to live in open environments like that, the physics of life also changes accordingly. In the forest, food is often more densely distributed and animals can hide. But on the grassland, everything is spread over large distances. That forces those giant creatures to move continuously to find food sources large enough to sustain their bodies. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs could begin to migrate seasonally like modern wildebeest or bison, but on a scale that is almost unimaginable. A large wildebeest herd in Africa today is already an extremely impressive sight. But imagine that same behavior in creatures weighing many tons, with long horns and thick armor. The ground could shake for many days just because of one migration passing through. And then there are the duck-billed dinosaurs. This is the group that I think could adapt extremely well to the grassland world. They already possessed an astonishing food-chewing system for a reptile species. Some species had hundreds of teeth operating almost like a biological conveyor belt, continuously replaced when worn down. In a world where grass became the main food source, that system could continue to evolve even stronger, because grass is not as easy to eat as many people think. It contains silica, almost like tiny glass particles that continuously wear down animal teeth. That means any creature that wants to survive by eating grass all day must solve an extremely serious mechanical problem. You need teeth that are hard enough, durable enough, and continuously renewed. And evolution is very good at solving problems like that over millions of years. I can imagine many herbivorous dinosaur species gradually developing heavier skulls, stronger jaw muscles, and more efficient chewing systems than any reptile species that ever existed in Earth's real history. But if the prey changes, the predators must change too. This is where the grassland dinosaur world begins to become truly interesting. In dense forest environments, ambush is an extremely effective strategy. You hide and then suddenly burst out at close range. But open grassland destroys almost all of that advantage. On flat ground stretching to the horizon, prey can see you from very far away. That means the old-style giant predator species could begin to face disadvantages. If you are too heavy, too slow, and consume too much energy, chasing prey over large distances becomes a physical nightmare. Physics is always extremely ruthless with energy-wasting systems. That could push the meat-eating dinosaur species into a completely new evolutionary direction. Lighter, faster, more efficient. Instead of relying only on pure strength, many species could begin to rely on endurance and coordination ability. Think about African wild dogs or modern wolves. They do not necessarily have to be stronger than their prey. They just need to exhaust the prey first. I would not be surprised if many meat-eating dinosaur species in this world gradually evolved in a similar direction. Longer legs, more balanced bodies, more efficient respiratory systems, possibly even a layer of insulating feathers that allow continuous activity in cold nighttime environments. And then pack hunting behavior begins to become an enormous advantage. A single individual would have a hard time taking down a multi-ton creature on open grassland. But a well-coordinated group is different. That means evolutionary pressure would not only act on muscles, but also on intelligence and social interaction. A predator that knows how to coordinate effectively with its kind would have a clear survival advantage. That means the grasslands would not only change the bodies of dinosaurs, but could also change the way they think and interact with each other. And if you look at the whole planet at this point, that world begins to resemble modern African savannas in a very strange way. There are herds of giant animals migrating seasonally. There are long-distance predators chasing them. There are cycles of drought, heavy rain, and biological movement happening continuously. But instead of lions, antelope, or elephants, the planet is covered with feathered reptiles, triceratops, and strange descendants of the ancient world that never disappeared. That would be an Earth familiar in terms of physics, but almost completely alien to humans. Really interesting thing is that after a few million years living on those vast grasslands, the descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex would probably no longer resemble the heavy, bulky image we are familiar with in museums. Humans often think evolution always tries to create bigger and stronger creatures, but physics often favors what is more efficient. On a planet full of open grasslands, where prey can see pursuing predators from very far away, pure strength is no longer the only advantage. Endurance ability begins to become much more important. If you are too heavy, you consume too much energy. If you accelerate too quickly, you generate too much heat. If you cannot run long enough, the prey will simply escape before you can get close. That is why many predator species on modern grasslands are not enormous muscle machines, but systems optimized for fish movement over large distances. And I think something similar could very well happen to the descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex. They could gradually become lighter, faster, and more balanced over millions of years. Longer legs, more flexible tails to maintain stability when running at high speed. Lighter skulls, but still strong enough to deliver lethal damage. Some species could develop thick feather layers to retain heat at night or in colder climates as the Earth continued to cool. It may sound strange compared to the classic dinosaur image, but if you look at birds today, you will realize that feathers are actually one of the most efficient biological technologies that ever appeared in nature. They are light, provide good insulation, and are extremely versatile. A long-distance running predator with an efficient bird-like respiratory system, lightweight hollow bones, and an insulating feather layer would be a terrifying creature in a completely different way from the classic Tyrannosaurus rex. It would not need to be stronger than the prey in the first few seconds. It would only need to be durable enough to keep chasing until the prey is exhausted. And that leads to another extremely important change: pack coordination. On open grassland, hunting alone becomes much harder against large prey. A solitary individual could fail very frequently, and failure in hunting is an extremely serious energy problem. You cannot continuously burn thousands of calories on futile runs. But if multiple individuals coordinate, everything changes completely. A group of predators could surround, split herds of prey, or take turns chasing until the target is exhausted. And this is when intelligence begins to become a real advantage. Not the kind of intelligence that builds rockets or cities, but the ability for social coordination, memory, predicting behavior, and effective communication with one's kind. In modern nature, you often see complex social behavior accompanied by brain development. Wolves, dolphins, crows, or chimpanzees all show that very clearly. The more complex a social system is, the more advantage a brain has if it can process more information. And I think many meat-eating dinosaur species in this world could begin to follow a similar direction. They could develop sound signals, body movements, or feather colors to communicate while hunting. Some species could recognize the position of each member in the pack just through low frequency, sounds like modern elephants do today. Others could learn hunting behavior from older individuals instead of acting purely on instinct. That creates a form of primitive biological culture where information is passed between generations. And this is where humans often start imagining too far and thinking about reptilian humans. But in reality, evolution does not need to go in that direction at all. A species does not need to build cities or invent machines to become one of the most successful creatures on the planet. Sharks have existed for hundreds of millions of years without needing an industrial civilization. Crows are extremely intelligent but still live as birds. Dolphins have complex social awareness but do not build technology. Evolution has no goal of creating a second version of humans. It only needs to create creatures efficient enough to continue existing in their environment. And in this world, the descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex could become extremely intelligent, agile, and social predators while still being completely dinosaurs. What always strikes me as strange is that if such a creature existed today, humans would probably view it as a form of intelligence, almost from another planet. But in this alternate timeline, that would simply be the natural evolutionary direction of life on Earth when the asteroid never actually fell. The thing I always find most fascinating in this story is that at some point, evolution could begin to experiment with what humans often think is their own privilege, higher intelligence. Not because evolution wants to create a civilization, but simply because in certain environments, better information processing provides a very real survival advantage. And if you look back at the fossils from the late Cretaceous, there is one particularly interesting group of dinosaurs in that direction. They were small, fast predator species with unusually high brain-to-body ratios for dinosaurs. Some species had relatively large skulls compared to body size, forward-facing eyes, and hands with more flexible fingers than most other reptiles. Those traits are very notable because in modern biology, they are often linked to higher cognition. Forward-facing eyes help create stereoscopic vision and accurate distance estimation, extremely useful for complex hunting. Hands with good grasping ability allow more effective manipulation of the environment. And when you combine that with social behavior, evolutionary pressure begins to change very quickly. But here is the important thing. Intelligence is not magic. It does not appear naturally just because a species deserves it. The brain is one of the most energy-expensive organs that ever appeared in nature. The human brain today occupies only a small portion of body mass, but consumes enormous amounts of energy. That means if evolution invests in a larger brain, it must receive survival benefits large enough to offset that cost. And in a world full of long-distance chases, social coordination, and constantly changing environments, those smarter small predator species could truly possess a very big advantage. I can imagine some descendants of the small predator species from the late Cretaceous beginning to develop increasingly complex behaviors, not building cities or making spaceships like in science fiction movies, but forms of cognition far more flexible than the instinctive monster image that humans often associate with dinosaurs. Some species could know how to use simple tools, not sophisticated machines, but perhaps using stones to crack hard shells, using branches to dig for food, or exploiting the environment in smarter ways. And this is not as unreasonable as many people think, because the direct descendants of dinosaurs are doing things very similar to that right now. Crows can solve multi-step puzzles. Some species know how to use tools to obtain food. Parrots have extremely strong learning ability and solve problems in astonishing ways. When you look at those behaviors, you begin to realize that bird-like intelligence is actually very different, but no less impressive than many mammals. And that is extremely important. Birds today are not only descendants of dinosaurs, they could be a glimpse into the direction that the cognition of ancient dinosaurs could have evolved toward if the asteroid had never collided. Imagine feathered predator species living in packs on ancient grasslands, communicating with complex sounds, remembering hunting tactics, and learning from their kind across generations. Some species could develop sophisticated visual signals through feather colors or body movements. Others could possess sound systems far more diverse than the simple roars usually depicted in movies. In fact, if you listen to modern birds communicating, you will realize that the sounds of dinosaur descendants are often much more complex than most people imagine. And when social behavior becomes more complex, pressure on the brain also increases. You have to recognize allies, rivals, position in the pack, danger signals, and hunting tactics. That could drive stronger cognitive development over millions of years. But this is where I think humans often make the biggest mistake. We always imagine that intelligence will eventually lead to a creature similar to humans, a reptilian human that knows how to build cities and wear clothes. But evolution does not work that way. A species can be extremely intelligent while still being completely itself. Dolphins did not evolve into underwater monkeys. Crows did not evolve into winged humans. They simply become more and more efficient in their own environments. And something similar could very well happen with dinosaurs. The smartest species in this world could become extremely sophisticated social creatures with strong memory, high learning ability, and complex hunting strategies while still being completely dinosaurs. No need for cities, no need for machines, no need for an industrial civilization, just smart enough to continue existing on a planet that never belonged to humans. One of the biggest changes in the timeline where the asteroid never collided would probably not be on land, but under the ocean. Because in our real world, after the extinction event, many marine ecosystems were left empty, and mammals eventually flooded into the ocean to occupy those vacancies. Whales, dolphins, seals, and many other marine mammals only appeared because the old ecosystems had collapsed. But if the collision never happened, modern oceans might not belong to mammals at all. They could still belong to marine reptiles. Think about that for a moment. For millions of years before the asteroid appeared, the oceans were full of creatures that were almost alien. Giant marine lizards longer than buses hunted in deep waters. Long-necked reptiles moved through the ocean with enormous paddle limbs. And if those ecosystems were not destroyed, evolution would continue refining them for tens of millions more years. The interesting thing is that the ocean often rewards extremely physically efficient body designs. Water is much denser than air, meaning any creature that wants to move fast underwater must solve very strict mechanical problems. You need to reduce drag. You need to optimize energy when swimming. And because physics is the same for all creatures, evolution often arrives at similar solutions even from completely different origins. That is why dolphins, sharks, and tuna look quite similar, even though they evolved from entirely different branches of life. That phenomenon is called convergent evolution, and I think it would appear very strongly in the oceans of the dinosaur world. Some marine reptile species could gradually develop increasingly streamlined bodies, stronger tails, and more efficient muscle systems for long-distance swimming. They might look somewhat like dolphins or whales to human eyes, but underneath that body would still be the biology of ancient reptiles. And then there are the apex predators. Mosasaurus-like marine lizards could continue evolving into increasingly sophisticated hunting machines. Some species could develop the ability to hunt in coordinated groups, like modern killer whales. Others could become long-distance chasers in open oceans. Imagine a creature more than 10 meters long, with a body fully optimized for underwater speed, possessing vision adapted to deep, dark seas, and enough social intelligence to coordinate hunts. That would be a form of apex predator almost beyond the imagination of modern humans. Meanwhile, the long-necked marine reptiles could occupy many roles that whales hold today. Some species could become giant plankton-eating creatures. Others could live in large herds, migrating across oceans. And the extremely interesting thing is that giant marine mammals might never appear, not because they were less evolved, but simply because those ecological niches were never left empty long enough for mammals to take over. This is something humans often forget about evolution. Creatures do not naturally appear just because they are better. They need ecological opportunities to exist and expand. If marine reptiles were still dominating the oceans, the ancestors of whales might forever remain small mammals living near the shores. That means the modern world would be different to an unimaginable degree. Imagine an Earth where the oceans are not filled with the songs of whales, but instead with the sounds of giant marine reptiles communicating underwater. A planet where creatures dozens of meters long surfacing are not blue whales, but descendants of dinosaur-era predators. From space looking down, that Earth would probably still look green like the world we know. But if you stepped onto the beach, it would look almost like it belonged to another planet. And the strangest thing is that physics could still lead life to familiar shapes, even with a completely different evolutionary history. Because in water, there are physical limits that are almost impossible to avoid. To swim fast, you need a streamlined body. To save energy, you need stable movement. To hunt efficiently in open oceans, you need vision, sensors, and a nervous system sophisticated enough to handle a constantly changing three-dimensional environment. That means even if whales never existed, the ocean would still be capable of creating creatures with similar shapes in a completely different way. And that is one of the most beautiful things about evolution. Life is always pulled by physics towards certain solutions, even if the path to get there changes completely. If the oceans of this world look almost like they belong to another planet, then the skies would probably be even stranger. Because in our real timeline, after the extinction event, most of the giant flying lizards disappeared and birds gradually took over the skies. But if the asteroid had never collided, the largest flying creatures on the planet would very likely not be eagles or seagulls. They would be descendants of the ancient flying lizards. The interesting thing is that many people often think giant flying creatures are almost impossible to exist, but physics actually does not forbid that at all. It only requires an extremely optimized design, and flying lizards had solved this problem in an almost astonishing way. Their skeletons were not heavy solid bone blocks, but lightweight hollow structures similar to load-bearing frames in modern engineering. You reduce mass, but still maintain enough rigidity to withstand forces in flight. That is extremely important because flying is one of the most energy-consuming activities in nature. If the body is too heavy, you simply cannot leave the ground. Some flying lizard species in the late Cretaceous already had wingspans wider than 10 meters, much larger than many modern private planes. And the scary thing is they probably had not even reached the final limit of evolution. In a world where they continued to exist for tens of millions more years, I think many branches could become even more specialized for long-distance flight. But this is when the atmosphere begins to play an extremely important role. Those giant creatures did not fly like sparrows flapping wings continuously. They exploited the physics of air. Rising hot air currents from the ground, atmospheric jet streams, and coastal winds could help them glide for hours with almost no energy cost. If you have ever seen modern vultures circling almost without flapping, you have seen a small version of that strategy. A giant flying creature with long wings could exploit those air currents extremely efficiently. That means the skies of Earth in this world would not be as quiet as today. Along the coasts, giant flying predators could glide hundreds of kilometers along the ocean to find carcasses, large fish, or schools of marine creatures near the surface. Imagine standing on a beach and seeing the shadow of a creature with wings wider than many small planes gliding over the ground below. Just that sight alone would be enough to make this world look completely alien to modern humans. Some species could specialize in hunting fish by diving from great heights. Others could become extremely aggressive food thieves in coastal areas. And the interesting thing is that the continued existence of giant flying lizards could completely change the future of birds. In the real world, large birds thrived after the giant flying competitors disappeared. But if those creatures continued to dominate the skies, many large bird branches might never appear. Evolution is always limited by ecological competition. If an environment is already occupied very efficiently, new species have a hard time expanding into it. That means birds in this world could still exist in great diversity, but most would be smaller, faster, and more agile instead of developing into giant creatures. Flying lizards would continue to hold dominance in the high airspace, just like eagles or vultures do in the modern world. And what always strikes me as strange is that all of this is completely consistent with the physics of life. If you have a skeleton light enough, wings large enough, and an atmosphere stable enough, there is no physical reason preventing giant creatures from continuing to dominate the skies. That means if the extinction event had never happened, the skies of modern Earth could look completely different. Human airplanes would probably have to share the airspace with ancient creatures nearly the size of small gliders. One of those rules is that climate is never stable forever. Even in the world where the asteroid never collided, Earth would eventually enter ice age cycles. Continents continue to drift. Ocean currents change. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuate in the atmosphere. Planetary orbits change very slowly over tens of thousands of years. And all of that combines into long cold periods that almost all life must adapt to survive. This is when the dinosaur world begins to become much stranger than the image humans usually associate with them. Most people still think dinosaurs belong to hot, humid swamps and tropical forests. But if they continued to exist for tens of millions more years, they would have to face a much colder planet. That creates completely new selective pressures. Species that could not retain heat would gradually die off. Species that adapted well to cold would expand. And this is where feathers became one of the most important biological technologies that ever appeared in the history of life. The interesting thing is that evolution rarely invents something completely new from scratch. it usually takes existing structures and changes their function. Feathers might initially have been used for insulation, display, or balance support. But as the climate cooled, they suddenly became an extremely efficient insulation system. Air trapped between feather layers creates a protective barrier against heat loss, similar to the winter coats of modern Arctic animals. And once that trait began to provide a big survival advantage, selection pressure would push it to develop even stronger over millions of years. I can imagine many dinosaur species in temperate and polar regions beginning to possess thicker feather layers, more compact bodies to retain heat better, and higher metabolic rates to function in cold climates. Some predator species could look almost like a strange mix between modern birds of prey and Arctic wolves. They move through snow on strong two legs, thick feathers rustling lightly in the cold wind, breath rising amid snowstorms on the dim light of polar winter. And the strange thing is that image may sound like science fiction, but in reality it is completely consistent with what we know about evolution and biological physics. A large body has an advantage in retaining heat better because of a lower surface area to volume ratio. Feathers help reduce heat loss. An efficient bird-like respiratory system helps maintain activity in cold oxygen environments. There is nothing in physics preventing dinosaurs from becoming creatures well adapted to ice and snow. Real fossils and life have even shown that many dinosaur species once lived in cold and dark conditions for many months continuously in ancient polar regions. That means the foundation for cold tolerance may have existed long before the real ice ages began. But perhaps the biggest change would be in migratory behavior. When climate fluctuates strongly between seasons, food is no longer distributed stably throughout the year. Giant animal herds would be forced to move seasonally over enormous distances to find food and avoid harsh weather. Imagine migrations larger than anything humans have ever seen in the modern world. Not a few thousand reindeer or antelope, but millions of giant creatures moving across continents under snow-covered skies. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs stretching to the horizon, with feathered predators running persistently behind them in snowstorms, waiting for a chance to separate a weak individual from the herd. The entire ecosystem would operate to the rhythm of ice, migration, and winter survival. Some polar species could even develop bodies similar to modern Arctic animals, thicker fat layers, shorter limbs to reduce heat loss, feather colors changing with the seasons for camouflage in snow. And the interesting thing is that evolution does not need to create everything from scratch to do that. It only exploits existing structures and refines them according to new environmental pressures. That is the thing I always find most beautiful about evolution. It is not like an engineer starting from a blank sheet. It is like a giant repairman of nature, continuously adjusting what already exists to adapt to a constantly changing world. And in this world, where the asteroid never truly ended the age of dinosaurs, ice ages might not destroy them. They might only turn them into things even stranger and more astonishing. When you start looking at this entire picture from a little further away, perhaps the strangest thing is not what dinosaurs would evolve into, but what would never appear. Because if dinosaurs continued to dominate most of the large ecosystems on land, mammals might never become the group of giant animals dominating the planet, like in our world. This does not mean mammals would disappear completely. In fact, they could still be very diverse, but most would be limited to smaller, more flexible ecological niches, with less direct competition with the dinosaur lineages that had claimed most of the energy in the ecosystems. There might still be species that climb trees, dig burrows, or live at night. Perhaps some primate branches would still appear in tropical forests. They could develop forward-facing eyes, flexible hands, and gradually larger brains over time. But here is the important part. The appearance of primates does not mean humans would appear. Humans often look back at evolutionary history as if the birth of technological intelligence was something almost certain to happen. But if you look more closely at biology, you will see that is extremely uncertain. In this world, primate branches might forever remain intelligent animals living in trees, in small ecological niches, surrounded by a planet that still belonged to dinosaurs. And if that happened, the entire history of civilization as we know it would never exist. There would be no agriculture in the sense that humans once developed. That is extremely important because agriculture is not just planting crops. It is the energy foundation for all civilization. When humans learned to control a stable food source, populations could grow rapidly. Cities would appear. Labor would become specialized. Technology would begin to accumulate across generations. But if no species followed that path, the world would forever have no cities, no industry, and no fossil fuel economy, no factories, no highways, no satellites orbiting in space, no spaceships leaving the planet to look back at Earth from space. And what always strikes me as strange is that that planet could still be extremely vibrant and beautiful even without any civilization. Perhaps even more beautiful in many ways. Because if there was no large-scale industrialization, most natural ecosystems would continue to exist. Vast primeval forests might still cover most continents. Oceans could be full of giant creatures never hunted en masse. Grasslands would still shake with biological migrations stretching thousands of kilometers. The skies would still be full of ancient flying creatures gliding on hot air currents. And the most important thing is that the planet's biodiversity could be much higher than modern Earth. Most human-caused extinction events would never happen. No industrial deforestation, no plastic pollution in the oceans, no climate change from burning fossil fuels. Life would continue to evolve in a world never restructured by a technological civilization. That leads to a question that I think many people do not like to face. Is human-like intelligence really the inevitable result of evolution? Or is it just an extremely rare and accidental branch in the history of life? Because if you look at the entire history of the planet, life existed for billions of years without needing to build telescopes, computers, or quantum physics. Evolution does not aim toward us. It only keeps creatures efficient enough to survive in their environment. And in many cases, that does not require technology or civilization. A species can be extremely successful without ever inventing the wheel. Sharks have existed longer than dinosaurs. Insects exist almost everywhere on the planet. Bacteria are still the most successful form of life in terms of total biomass and adaptability. That means there's no rule in physics or biology saying the universe must create humans. And that is what makes this world both strange and beautiful in a very profound way. Earth does not need humans to be a beautiful planet. Ancient forests would still sway in the wind. Ice would still form and melt according to climate cycles. Herds of giant creatures would still migrate under star-filled skies. Oceans would still move according to the moon's gravity. And life would still continue to evolve, adapt, and change without ever knowing that in another timeline there were creatures who once called this place the world of humans. The thing I always find strangest when talking about evolution is that most humans, almost by default, believe that intelligence is the natural pinnacle of life. We look at cities, telescopes, computers, and spaceships, and unconsciously think that evolution somehow always heads toward a human-like outcome. But if you truly look at the biology and physics of life, you will see nature does not work that way at all. Evolution has no final goal. It has no secret plan to create consciousness or technological civilization. Evolution is simply the result of natural selection, acting on creatures that survive long enough to reproduce more effectively than others. That means what evolution really optimizes is not intelligence, not morality, and not science. It optimizes the ability to continue existing. And sometimes the most successful creatures are the simplest ones. In fact, if you look at the entire history of Earth, one of the most successful forms of life was never dinosaurs or humans. It was bacteria. They exist almost everywhere, in soil, in oceans, under rocks kilometers deep, in hot acidic lakes, and even inside our own bodies. They survived every major mass extinction the planet has ever experienced. They existed billions of years before the first animals appeared, and they will very likely still exist long after humans are gone. That may sound a bit insulting to human pride, But physics does not care what makes us feel special. A life form does not need to build telescopes to be extremely successful biologically. And that is where the story of consciousness begins to become truly strange. Because if you look at the history of life coldly, consciousness may only be an extremely rare biological accident. The first billions of years of Earth passed without any creature that knew how to think about its own existence. Life simply reproduced, competed, and adapted. Then very late in the planet's history, in a very small branch of the evolutionary tree, brains complex enough to begin asking questions about the universe appeared. And even that could only be the result of a series of random events following one another. If the asteroid had never collided, dinosaurs might continue to dominate most large ecosystems. Some species could become extremely intelligent in their own way. Some could develop very complex social behaviors. But there is no guarantee that would lead to technological civilization. There is no rule saying intelligence must eventually create microscopes, jet engines, or the internet. Dolphins are very intelligent, but do not build cities underwater. Crows solve multi-step problems, but do not invent mathematics. Evolution only needs a creature efficient enough to continue existing in its environment. If a feathered predator species can coordinate perfect pack hunts, retain heat well in ice ages, and adapt quickly to changing climates, then it is already extremely successful. It does not need to invent spaceships to prove anything. And that is what always makes me find both beautiful and terrifying about the universe. The universe has no obligation to create creatures that can think about the universe itself. There is no physical law saying that somewhere in the evolutionary process, a certain planet must create brains that look up at the sky and wonder why the stars exist. Perhaps most life in the universe is simply bacteria, plants, or complex ecosystems that never develop technology. Perhaps consciousness is actually extremely rare. And if that is true, then our own existence is far stranger than most humans have ever imagined. Because in the timeline where the asteroid never fell, Earth could still be a vibrant, diverse, and breathtakingly beautiful planet without any creature ever being smart enough to realize it. Humans often make a mistake when thinking about intelligence in that we almost always view modern civilization as the inevitable final result of high cognition. We look at cities, machines, electricity, and the internet and unconsciously believe that any species intelligent enough will eventually follow a similar path. But biology actually shows nothing of the sort. Dolphins have extremely developed brains, complex social communication, and astonishing learning ability, but they do not build factories under the ocean. Octopuses can solve problems, open lock boxes, and remember environments extremely well, but they do not invent metallurgy. That means intelligence and industrialization are two completely different things. A species can be extremely aware without ever creating technological civilization. And that is what I think is very likely to happen in the world where dinosaurs continue to exist. Some small predatory dinosaur branches could develop larger brains, more complex societies, and more flexible behaviors over tens of millions of years. They could communicate with sophisticated sound systems, pass learned behaviors across generations, and form stable social structures. Some species could recognize individual members in their group, cooperate in hunts, care for young, and remember territories over enormous distances. If humans observed them today, we would probably call them intelligent species. But that does not mean they would build cities. One of the most important reasons is that biological bodies strongly determine the direction intelligence can take. Humans possess extremely flexible hands with opposable thumbs. That allows precise manipulation of objects, creation of sophisticated tools, and eventually mechanical engineering. But even grasping ability does not automatically lead to technology. Monkeys have very flexible hands but do not build steam engines. Crows use tools but do not invent metallurgy. That means between being able to manipulate the environment and building industrial civilization, there is an enormous gap. And then there is one other extremely important thing: fire. Most of human technology actually began with the ability to control fire. Without fire, there is no metallurgy, no pottery, no heat engines, no industry. But controlling fire depends on a series of very specific conditions. You need creatures that live long enough to accumulate knowledge. You need an environment dry enough to maintain stable burning. You need flexible forelimbs to maintain and transport fire. You need social structures that allow skills to be passed across generations. And you need a planet with a large amount of free oxygen in the atmosphere for fire to work efficiently. That means human technological civilization may be the result of many successive coincidences rather than the inevitable result of intelligence. In this dinosaur world, I can imagine the emergence of species with extremely high awareness, but never entering the industrial age. Perhaps they live in complex packs on cold grasslands. Perhaps they possess sophisticated sound communication similar to primitive language. Perhaps they have strong social memory and extremely high learning ability. Some species might even create simple tools from branches or stones. But that does not mean they would start smelting steel or building computers. In fact, most intelligent life on Earth today does not follow that path. And that is what makes this story truly strange. You can have a planet full of highly aware creatures and still have no cities, satellites, or technological civilization. A world where intelligence exists as a survival strategy rather than a tool to restructure the planet. Herds of feathered predatory dinosaurs could possess extremely rich social lives, but forests would continue to grow freely. Oceans would remain pristine. Skies would belong to giant flying creatures instead of jet planes. And that reminds us of a truth very uncomfortable to human pride. Modern civilization is not a certain result of evolution. It may only be an extremely rare chain of accidents that happened in the right order on the right planet at the right time. If just one link in that chain changed, if the asteroid missed by a few minutes, if dinosaurs did not disappear, if mammals never took over large ecosystems, then perhaps the universe would never create a species capable of looking up at the stars and wondering where it came from. We look at cities, satellites, computers, and spaceships, and unconsciously believe that humans are the natural pinnacle of evolution, as if the entire history of life on Earth had been quietly trying to reach us from the very beginning. But if you look at the history of this planet from the perspective of biology instead of human pride, that idea begins to collapse almost immediately, because evolution has no concept of superior in a moral or philosophical sense. It does not award medals to the smartest species. It does not care which creature can do math or write symphonies. Evolution only keeps traits that help creatures survive and reproduce more effectively in their environment. And by that standard, dinosaurs were one of the most successful animal groups that ever appeared on this planet. They dominated Earth for about 165 million years. Pause for a moment so the human brain can truly absorb that number. The entire history of Homo sapiens is only about 300,000 years. Modern civilization with electricity, engines, and industry is only a few centuries old. That means if you compress the entire history of dinosaurs into 1 year, the technological civilization of humans would appear in just the last few seconds before midnight on December 31. And the strange thing is that throughout that nearly endless period, dinosaurs never needed the internet, factories, or telescopes to continue dominating the planet. That always makes me feel that humans are looking at evolution from an extremely self-centered perspective. We think abstract intelligence must be the most superior thing in nature, simply because we possess it. But ecosystems do not operate according to that logic. A forest does not care which species knows philosophy. The ocean does not reward quantum physics. Nature only responds to energy, reproduction, and adaptation. A species that exists longer is not necessarily smarter, but it is almost certainly very efficient in its environment. Sharks have barely changed much over hundreds of millions of years because their biological design already worked extremely well. Insects are present in almost every ecosystem on the planet, even though they do not build technological civilizations. And bacteria, something humans rarely consider advanced, are one of the most successful life forms in Earth's history. They exist in ice, in acid, under rocks kilometers deep, and even inside our own bodies. They survived every major mass extinction the planet has ever experienced. That means from the cold perspective of biology, long-term survival ability is often far more important than the ability for abstract thought. And this is where the story of humans becomes truly fragile. We often imagine modern civilization as something huge and permanent, but on the geological timescale, it is almost insignificant. The entire industrial history of humans is shorter than the lifespan of many ancient trees. The cities we think are eternal could disappear completely after just a few thousand years if no one maintains them. Even satellites in orbit would eventually fall or stop working. That means if you look at Earth from a distance of tens of millions of years, the traces of human civilization might only look like an unusually thin geological layer that existed for an extremely short time and then vanished. Meanwhile, dinosaurs existed for so long that mountain ranges formed and were completely eroded during the time they dominated the planet. And what is even stranger is that they achieved that without needing any technological civilization. That does not mean human intelligence is not special. It is extremely special. But special does not mean inevitable. There is no physical law saying the universe must create creatures that build telescopes and then look back at the universe itself. Perhaps most planets with life in the cosmos have never produced any technological civilization. Perhaps most are just forests, oceans, bacteria, or complex ecosystems operating for hundreds of millions of years without any creature wondering, who are we? And if the Chicxulub asteroid had missed by just a few minutes, our Earth would very likely have become such a world. A planet where dinosaurs continued to evolve, hunt, migrate, and adapt for tens of millions more years while humans never appeared. No cities, no spaceships, no modern science, but life would still continue to develop extremely successfully. And that is what always makes me feel both terrifying and incredibly beautiful about evolution. It does not promise that intelligence will win. It only promises that the things best adapted to the current environment will exist a little longer before the world changes again. If you stand on a high hill in this world and look out at the horizon, the first feeling would probably not be, this is another planet. The first feeling would be something much stranger. This is still Earth, but a version where humans were never allowed to appear. The continents would still be roughly similar to the modern map because plate tectonics does not care whether humans exist or not. North America would still sit in the North Atlantic. Antarctica would still be covered in ice at the South Pole. The Himalayas would still rise from the collision of continental plates. The oceans would still move according to the moon's gravity. If viewed from space, this planet would probably still carry the familiar blue color of Earth. But as you get closer, everything begins to become alien in a nearly disorienting way. On grasslands stretching to the horizon, herds of giant reptiles would still move seasonally like biological rivers that never end. Creatures with long horns, thick armor, and bodies weighing many tons would walk slowly through grass rustling in the cold wind. Far behind them, feathered predator species would run in wide formations, moving persistently for many hours instead of bursting out in ambushes like the classic images in movies. Some species might have developed thick enough fur to live in polar snow. Others might have adapted to hot, dry climates in equatorial plains. But no matter which direction they evolved, they would still carry within their bodies the traces of the ancient world that never truly ended. The oceans would make planet even more alien. There would be no blue whales surfacing, no pods of dolphins swimming beside human ships, because there would be no ships in that sense to begin with. Instead, the open seas might be full of descendants of ancient marine reptiles, creatures dozens of meters long gliding through cold waters, with bodies fully optimized for ocean movement. Some species would hunt in groups in deep waters like modern killer whales. Others would migrate thousands of kilometers along ancient ocean currents. If a human somehow appeared in this world and saw the shadow of a creature longer than a bus rising through ocean mist, they would probably think they were looking at a planet outside the solar system rather than Earth. And then there is the sky. Perhaps this is the part that makes this world most different from our modern intuition. There would be no contrails from jet planes cutting across the atmosphere, no sound of engines echoing from 10 kilometers high. Instead, giant flying creatures would still glide on hot air currents along the coasts, just as their ancestors did tens of millions of years ago. Some would have wingspans larger than many modern private planes. They would barely need to flap their wings much and would simply glide using the pure physics of the atmosphere. From the ground looking up, their shadows could cover an entire wide area as they passed across the sunlight. And what always strikes me as strange is that even though all of those things look almost alien, this planet would still be completely Earth. Gravity would still be the same. The air would still contain oxygen. Rain would still fall into the oceans and evaporate back up. Storms would still form over tropical seas. Forests would still photosynthesize under sunlight, just as they have for hundreds of millions of years. Physics would not change. Only the history of life would have followed a different branch. Perhaps the forests and swamps in this world would be vastly larger than today because industrial-scale deforestation would never have existed. Primal forests could stretch continuously across multiple continents. Ancient swamps full of giant insects and amphibians would still exist in wetlands never turned into cities or highways. The entire planet could contain much greater biodiversity than the current world. And that is the part that makes this story truly worth thinking about. Just one very small physical change, an asteroid missing Earth by a few minutes, could rewrite the entire history of the planet. No humans, no technological civilization, no telescopes to observe distant galaxies. But Earth would still orbit the sun as before. Mountains would still form and erode. Life would still continue to adapt, evolve, and change for tens of millions more years, without ever knowing that in another timeline, there had once existed creatures who called this place the world of humans. The thing I always find strangest when thinking about this world is that it forces humans to face a truth we often find very hard to accept. The beauty of Earth does not depend on whether anyone is there to observe it. We have a tendency to unconsciously view the universe as a stage set up for the human experience. We talk about the beauty of sunset, the majesty of the ocean, or the grandeur of mountains, as if all of those things only truly have meaning when a human brain stands looking at them. But physics does not work that way. Stars still burned for billions of years before any creature on Earth had eyes to see their light. Ocean waves still crashed against shores long before there was poetry or music. Forests still swayed in the wind for hundreds of millions of years before anyone called it beautiful. And in the timeline where dinosaurs never disappeared, that becomes clearer than ever. Earth's ecosystems existed for an extremely long time before human civilization. In fact, if you compress the entire planetary history into one day, modern civilization would appear in just the final moment before midnight. For most of that history, there were no cities, no language, and no creature capable of rewriting the story of the world around them. But nature still operated perfectly. Oceans still circulated heat around the planet. Storms still formed over tropical seas and dissolved into the atmosphere. Ocean currents still moved creatures and nutrients between waters thousands of kilometers apart. Life still evolved, adapted, and went extinct according to rhythms so long they almost exceed human intuition. And in the world where the asteroid never collided, all of that would still continue without needing us to exist. Herds of giant dinosaurs would still migrate across frost-covered grasslands under the dawn light. Giant flying creatures would still glide on hot air currents along the oceans. Marine reptiles would still hunt in the dark, deep waters beneath polar ice. Primeval forests would still grow and collapse through millions of years of climate change. No audience, no biologist, no telescopes looking up at the night sky to wonder how vast the universe is. And that sounds both terrifying and extremely beautiful in a way that is very hard to describe, because it reminds us that reality is not built around human expectations. The universe has no obligation to create creatures that can observe it. There is no physical law saying that a planet with life must eventually produce science, art, or philosophy. Perhaps most life in the cosmos has never developed beyond forests, oceans, and complex food chains. Perhaps consciousness is only an extremely rare accident in the history of matter. And if that is true, then our Earth in the real timeline is an almost unbelievable exception. But in this alternate timeline, nature would still be complete without any civilization to perceive it. This is the part that makes me think the most. Humans often say nature needs to be protected, as if we are the center of the story. But if looked at on the geological timescale, life has survived disasters far greater than anything humans have ever created. Nature does not lack anything if we do not exist. Mountains still form. Rivers still flow. Life still evolves. Earth does not need humans to continue being a vibrant and wondrous planet. And in fact, in many ways, it could be even wilder and more diverse if industrial civilization had never appeared. That does not make human life meaningless. On the contrary, it makes our existence much stranger. We are not the inevitable center of the universe. We are only a very new small branch in a cosmos that has operated for billions of years without needing us. And in some way, I always find that both makes humans smaller and makes the moment we exist to think about all of this far more astonishing. The scariest thing in this entire story is not the giant predators with teeth tens of centimeters long, or the flying creatures with wingspans larger than small planes. What is truly scariest is the unbelievably fragile nature of human history itself. Because when you look back at everything we have just discussed, you begin to realize that modern civilization may not be the inevitable result of evolution, but only the consequence of a single cosmic accident that happened at the right time. We often think the appearance of humans is something almost certain, that if we rewind history and let Earth run again, sooner or later an intelligent species would build cities and look up at the stars. But physics makes no such promise. If the Chicxulub asteroid had missed by just a little, the entire history of humanity might never have happened. No humans, no civilization, no one stepping on the moon, no one building telescopes to see galaxies billions of light years away. Everything we call human history may depend only on a cosmic object falling in the right spot on the planet 66 million years ago. And what always overwhelms me is that the event was not even aimed at us. The asteroid did not appear to create opportunities for mammals. It simply followed its physical orbit. But the consequences of that collision opened up a series of ecological vacancies that mammals eventually occupied. Then from those tiny creatures living in the shadow of dinosaurs, through tens of millions of years of evolution, a species finally emerged that began asking questions about the universe itself. That makes our civilization look very different from the perspective of deep time. We like to think humans are the center of the story of life on Earth. But in reality, civilization may only be an extremely small branch on the giant evolutionary tree of this planet, a new, thin branch, and perhaps extremely temporary. For most of Earth's history, there was no creature capable of abstract thought. Life simply reproduced, competed, and adapted. And if the asteroid had never collided, that might have continued for tens of millions more years without any technological civilization ever appearing. This is where the story begins to become almost cosmological, because if consciousness is truly this rare on a planet like Earth, then it may also be rare throughout the entire universe. We often assume that out there, somewhere, there must be many advanced civilizations because we exist to think about it. But that may only be the bias of consciousness itself. Perhaps most planets with life in the cosmos have never produced creatures smart enough to look up at the sky and wonder, who are we? Perhaps most only contain bacteria, forests, or complex ecosystems operating for hundreds of millions of years in complete silence. And the scary thing is that physics makes no promise that intelligence will always appear. There is no law saying evolution must create brains that can do math or build telescopes. Natural selection only cares whether a creature survives long enough to pass on its genes. If a planet full of forests, oceans, and giant reptiles has operated very stably for hundreds of millions of years, evolution has no reason to invent technological civilization. That makes our existence fragile in an almost terrifying way. All of human art, science, music, mathematics, and memory may exist only because of a cosmic object striking the right place on Earth tens of millions of years ago. If that orbit had changed by just a little, this planet would probably still be full of life, still incredibly beautiful, and still operating perfectly without any creature ever realizing it. And the more I think about it, the more I feel that the most astonishing thing is not that dinosaurs once dominated Earth. The most astonishing thing is that through a nearly unbelievable chain of events, the universe finally created creatures strange enough to sit here and wonder what would have happened if that had never occurred. 66 million years ago, a giant asteroid was hurtling through the darkness of space toward Earth at a speed faster than any object humans have ever built. It had no consciousness, no goal, no plan to change the history of life. It simply moved according to the orbit that gravity had imposed on it millions of years earlier. And what always strikes me as almost unbelievably strange is that the entire story we have just gone through can only be told in the timeline where that asteroid actually collided. If it had arrived a few minutes earlier, a few minutes later, or deviated by only a very small distance in space, there might never have existed any creature smart enough to wonder what had happened. That is the part that always makes me shudder when thinking about evolution. We often view the history of life as if the appearance of humans was something almost inevitable. We unconsciously think that if we rewind the entire history of Earth and let it play out again, sooner or later a species would appear that builds cities, makes telescopes, and begins thinking about the universe. But physics makes no such promise. Biology makes no such promise either. If the Chicxulub asteroid had never struck the Yucatan Peninsula, the world at the end of the Cretaceous might have continued to exist for tens of millions more years. The giant ecosystems would still operate almost normally. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs would still migrate across ancient plains. Feathered predator species would continue evolving into creatures that were faster, smarter, and better adapted to the planet's gradually cooling climate. The oceans would still be full of ancient marine reptiles. The skies would still belong to giant flying creatures with wingspans much wider than many modern small planes. And in that world, there might never have been any technological civilization. No wheel, no electricity, no spaceship, no one standing on the moon looking back at Earth and realizing how small their planet is in the cosmos. That means human intelligence may not be destiny. It may only be the result of a planetary disruption, a cosmic accident that destroyed the old world and accidentally opened opportunities for a small, different branch of life to develop. And what always amazes me is that the collision did not want to create humans. The asteroid did not appear to save mammals or give mammals the chance to dominate Earth. It simply followed the cold physical laws of motion and gravity. But the consequences of that collision caused the near total collapse of the ecosystems dominating the planet at the time. When dust and sulfur blanketed the sky, sunlight diminished sharply, food chains broke down, and giant creatures that needed enormous amounts of energy every day began to disappear. In that darkness, the small mammals living underground survived. And through the next tens of millions of years of evolution, a species finally emerged that began asking questions about its own history. That makes our entire civilization look extremely fragile on the geological timescale. We like to think civilization is something huge and eternal, but in reality, the entire industrial history of humans is shorter than the lifespan of many ancient trees. The cities we think will exist forever could disappear completely after just a few thousand years if no one maintains them. Meanwhile, dinosaurs once dominated the planet long enough for mountain ranges to form and nearly erode away during their time of existence. And the strange thing is they achieved that without needing any technological civilization. That reminds us of a truth very uncomfortable to human pride. Evolution does not aim toward intelligence. Natural selection only keeps what works efficiently in the current environment. If a planet full of forests, oceans, and giant reptiles has operated very stably for hundreds of millions of years, evolution has no reason to create quantum physics or telescopes. And that is where this story begins to become almost cosmological. Because if consciousness is truly this rare even on Earth itself, then it may also be extremely rare throughout the entire universe. We often look at the night sky and imagine that out there somewhere there must be many advanced civilizations. But perhaps most planets with life in the cosmos have never produced creatures smart enough to wonder why they exist. Perhaps most are only forests, oceans, bacteria, or giant ecosystems operating in silence for billions of years. And the scary thing is that physics makes no promise that it will be different. There is no law saying that somewhere in the history of a planet, art, mathematics, or science must appear. Perhaps consciousness is only an extremely rare accident in the history of matter. But that is precisely what makes reality much more beautiful to me. Science does not make the universe less wondrous. It makes the universe stranger, deeper, and far more astonishing than human intuition. It shows that behind everything familiar, there are always layers of cold and more surprising causes than we once imagined. And what always overwhelms me the most is that from all that chaos, the universe finally created creatures strange enough to sit here and wonder what would have happened if the asteroid had never fallen. Perhaps somewhere out there among the billions of worlds in the cosmos, there exist planets where dinosaurs never disappeared. Planets where giant creatures still move under star-filled skies, where oceans still belong to ancient marine reptiles, and where no civilization ever appears smart enough to realize the beauty of its own planet. And the strangest thing is that if you are sitting here listening to this story, that can only mean that in our timeline, the asteroid really did collide. If you want to continue exploring the strangest hypotheses of the universe, the mysteries of evolution, and the facts that make reality stranger than science fiction, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories. And now, thank you for joining me on this journey through 66 million years of history of asteroid that changed the entire fate of life on Earth. See you in our next journey between science and the universe.